Thank you very much, Stuart, for that. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along this evening. I'm just wanting to talk a little bit about aspects of Cardinal Wolsey that I've been looking at in preparation of this biography of him. I found writing a biography much more difficult than I sort of imagined. I've written sort of thematic books and comparative books, etc., but just sort of settling on sort of one life and its significance has proved raised issues and ideas which I hadn't expected. So I'm going to try and essentially leave out the boring bits, of which there are, I'm afraid, quite a lot with Cardinal Wolsey. He spent a lot of his day doing really boring stuff, but the context of it all and his rise and of course his fall is, I guess, in any life, the most exciting beginning and the end. So, he's always, so there we have him. There's Wolsey, the only sort of recognised portrait of him, which is the National Gallery in London. And his arms, which I'll show you a better image of, or a bigger image of later, and explain a little bit about what all of that means. Wolsey's been one of those characters who has always divided people, and he's been defined by history, and particularly by the changes in history, both in, well, I mean, the actual changes in history and historiography. The earliest account, if all this works properly, what's working here too? Hello. Hello. There we go. The earliest accounts of, he does look like Tony Hancock, doesn't he? In that, so those of you who are old enough like me to know Tony Hancock, on a bad Sunday afternoon. This is, of course, a 19th century depiction of Wolsey as the cardinal at the trial of the marriage between Henry and Catherine. He's always divided people. The earliest account of him is that which was written by his gentleman usher, George Cavendish, who was a bit like a sort of aide-de-camp, or his butler, written in the reign of Queen Mary I, when the author was much older, and only a year or two before his own death. He is a very sympathetic biographer of Wolsey, and sees him really as the victim of time and fortune, which is why on the front cover of that edition of the book, The Life and Death of Cardinal Wolsey, you have the Wheel of Time, and this is his great theme, that Wolsey's greatness was always destined to be, but it was always destined to fall, because of that is the nature of humanity and humankind. He did less well in the hands of his subsequent biographers, particularly John Fox, the Protestant martyrologist. He had a very different view of Wolsey. He picked up on a number of satires that were written about Wolsey during his lifetime by the poet John Skelton, and he castigated Wolsey as the epitome of all the corrupt and worldliness which was characteristic, he said, of the late medieval Catholic Church that needed to be changed. And he contrasted Wolsey's life with that of Thomas Cromwell, whose providential existence, he said, quote, his whole life was nothing else but a continual care and travail how to advance and further the right knowledge of the gospel and reform of the house of God. So he cast Wolsey as the enemy of true religion, and Cromwell as the great bringer of it, completely ignoring the fact that Cromwell was in fact the principal client of Wolsey, and his knowledge of Wolsey's affairs was what got him translated, I suppose, into royal service. And that contrast between Wolsey and Cromwell has gone all the way down through the historiography, and it's reappeared only last month in the biography of Thomas Cromwell published by Dermot McCulloch last month. And yet again we get that sort of dichotomy between the two of them, although Dermot's view is of course rather more sympathetic, and he recognises the significance of Cromwell for Wolsey and each other. Excuse me. In the Victorian period, it is the heyday of Whig history, where in every field history was, of course, the inexorable rise and triumph of liberal parliamentary democracy and ministers and things who have or haven't resigned as of today. A kind of sense that the dark forces of the medieval period were being overcome, and somebody like, for example, James Froude, the great Victorian historian of the Tudor period, saw the fall of Wolsey to the defeat of the Spanish Armada as one of the inevitable national progresses towards Brexit and national salvation, apart from the terrible institution in Europe, namely the papacy. And that was picked up again in the 20th century by Pollard. I really have no idea where I'm supposed to point this to make it work. Pollard's biography of Wolsey, published in about 1902, he viewed Wolsey as ruthlessly ambitious and a self-aggrandizing man who saw himself as a potential pope and who strove at every turn to increase his control over the church in England in order to serve the papacy as well as the king, in the hopes one day of perhaps wearing the shoes of the fisherman himself. And that's how he characterized the Cardinal's life. And this view held sway until the middle of the century, when the late Professor Sir Geoffrey ELTON found yet again a different kind of Wolsey in his researches. He furthered the dichotomy that I'm talking about between Wolsey and Cromwell, which I just referred to, and in a sense he echoed Froude's 19th century view. Wolsey, according to ELTON, was a pompous, immoral, egotistical man, possessed of considerable talent, but one who squandered it on self-indulgence and attempting to overawe other people, conscious of his own humble origins. And in fact, not that different a view from Wolsey's own critics. He put him as a second-rate candidate who would barely make the scrape into the top 10 list of Britain's or England's statesmen. His foreign policy failed, he said. He took on too much domestically, he didn't understand economics, and was completely corrupt. And of course, the antidote was Elton's great hero, Thomas Cromwell, who was the exact opposite, and, the most marvellous thing since sliced bread, even though they didn't have it in the Tudor period. What Elton completely ignores is some of the things which have now begun to interest historians in the 40, 50 years since he was writing. And that is Wolsey's role as a patron, particularly as an educational patron, which I'll say a little bit more about. He also ignored completely Wolsey as a courtier, also Wolsey as the king's friend, which I'll come back to, and his architectural and artistic patronage. And if you ignore all of that, which is a lot of what Wolsey did, then you can quite easily dismiss him. And favour, of course, Cromwell as the great bringer forth of the Tudor Revolution. That view changed in the 60s and 70s with Jack Scarisbrick's biography of Henry VIII. He didn't write on Wolsey directly, but he wrote marvellously about Wolsey in his biography of Henry VIII, which I still think, Starkey not being around, I still think is the best biography of... I tell my students, forget Starkey and the others, read Scarisbrick on Henry VIII if you really want to understand him. He portrays the Cardinal as prodigiously talented and a sophisticated planner, who was no worse, at least, than many other prelates of his day, and was genuinely visionary when it came to Henry VIII's foreign policy, of which I'll say a little bit more later. And that's led, in more recent decades, to the work of people like John Guy, Stephen Gunn, and of course John Guy wrote very much about Wolsey's role in Star Chamber and as the Lord Chancellor of England, and it was really quite a groundbreaking book. And then there followed Peter GWYN's book, still the most recent doorstopper on Wolsey, and which appeared as long ago as about 1991. Absolutely unreadable, but fantastically well researched. It's absolutely it's an archive in itself, and I find myself very much trying to write a more tight and concise biography of the Cardinal. I find myself much in debt. In fact, after all these years, when I hated him, I've actually come to quite value Peter GWYN's work because it's kind of all there. It's just a pity it's not very easy to read. And so these historians, Gunn, GWYN and others, have portrayed Wolsey as a still splendid but rather less isolated figure, one who was dominant among, but working with, and of course against, other people as part of Henry VIII's court and his regime to its middle years. And of course the book his book is entitled The King's Cardinal, rather than the Pope's. And it was really Gwyn who first said, look, it's not the papacy that Wolsey's interested in, it's Henry VIII. And it still, I think, quite reasonably frames the debate, including my own thoughts on the Cardinal. So as to Wolsey himself, he was born in about 1472. His father, excuse me, I've had a cold recently, so I may cough a bit. His father, Robert, whom Cavendish described in his biography as a, quote, poor, honest man, he's often described as a butcher. He wasn't. He was a grazier and a small landholder. But he did probably have some kind of butchery business as part of this. So he was not, you know, a man in a red and white apron on the high street selling chops, in our modern sense of the term. But that idea of Wolsey as being the butcher's cur was a deliberate denigration of him. So he came from quite well-to-do yeoman stock from Suffolk and Ipswich, to which he and indeed McCulloch have a very personal and close connection. He was educated first at Ipswich and then he went to Oxford. He went first to the school at Oxford, which was run by Magdalen College, and then went to their college itself. Graduating, he told Cavendish, and no one is really quite sure whether this is true, because the records don't survive, at 15 with a BA. And he was therefore described himself as the, quote, boy bachelor. It was unusual to graduate with a degree at that early age, but not unique. There were people who graduated much younger than our general perception. By 1497, he'd completed an MA, and he was made a Fellow of Magdalen College, which we see there. He became the bursar of the college, but by about 1500, but was forced to withdraw, apparently over some financial improprieties, something to do with the building of that tower. So the story goes that he either fiddled the books or got money from somewhere to enable them to build the tower. But there's actually no evidence whatsoever of any financial impropriety. And the reason he probably left Magdalen College quickly was that he got an even better job, and that was to become, under the patronage of Thomas Gray, the Marquis of Dorset. Oh yes, that's an interesting painting of 1856 of the dining hall in Magdalen College, Oxford. But what you see, interestingly, there is that painting, which is actually the one that is now in Christchurch. But no one can tell me whether it was then in Magdalen and moved to Christchurch or whatever happened. Anyway, a bit of obscure art history. Yes. Oh, so there we go. There's the arm of Sir Thomas Gray, the Marquis of Dorset. He was made tutor to Lord Grey's sons and rector of Lymington in Somerset. And that was probably the real reason for him having to leave Oxford as quickly as he did, because the rules at Magdalen were that if you'd got a living outside the university, you couldn't remain in your post there. From there, within a year, he'd become chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Dean, who was involved in all kinds of negotiations for Henry VII, and with whom Wolsey learnt his diplomatic training. By 1507, he was a chaplain to Henry VII himself, and came to the attention of Richard Fox, who was the Bishop of Winchester. And as Cavendish puts it, Bishop Fox, quote, in process of time after often resort, he perceived this chaplain to have a very fine wit, and what wisdom was packed in his head, and thought him a meet and apt person to be preferred in witty affairs. In other words, people are seeing quite early in Wolsey's career that he's exceptional in what he does. In 1508, he was sent on an embassy to the Netherlands to discuss a possible marriage between Henry VII and Margaret of Savoy. And he apparently accomplished the task within a few days, and so astonished Henry VII by the speed and efficiency of his work that he was rewarded with the deanery of Lincoln Cathedral. The story goes that Henry VII sort of saw him loitering about a few days after having given him instructions to go to the Netherlands, and said to him, "Haven't you left yet?" And he said, "Well, actually, I've been and gone and come back, and I've finished all what you wanted me to do." And so impressed was Henry that he promoted him to the deanery. There is Henry VII. Just pass on from here. And that's also an image of Henry from that time. In 1509, at the accession of Henry VIII, of course, as who we're particularly interested in, he was made the King's Almoner. And the Almoner was responsible for the King's charitable giving, so that he looked after the particular charities that Henry supported. He was also in charge of distributing the food that was collected after banquets and things, and making sure it was distributed properly, something which supermarkets are only now just learning to do, to not throw the stuff away, but actually redistribute it down the social chain, as it were. He also became the Canon of the Chapel Royal at Windsor and Registrar of the Order of the Garter. The fact that he was the Almoner made him also a member of the King's Council, and this is where he really begins to make his mark. So, thank you, Mark. Henry, as the young king, as everybody knows, is interested in this kind of thing, jousting and hunting and doing all that kind of stuff. The Royal Council had tried to make him work as a proper king, like his father had been, sitting down with the council, doing all that kind of stuff. But Wolsey was very different. He usually initiated some idea, discussed it with the king, and then the Royal Council were invited to comment. A bit like, who's the bloke who actually organised this Brexit deal? Never mind Dominic Raab, it's the senior civil servant, I forget his name, who chats with Theresa May, I think he's still Prime Minister. And they actually organised this deal that's been published yesterday, apparently. So, yes, Oliver Roberts. He's a bit like an Oliver Roberts character. In other words, they decided what they wanted and then they presented it to the cabinet. They had to like it or not. According to Cavendish, Henry favoured Wolsey because, quote, "he was the most earnest and readiest among all the council to advance the king's only will and pleasure, without any respect to the case. The king therefore perceived him to be a meet instrument for the accomplishment of his devised will and pleasure, called him more near unto him, and esteemed him so highly that in his estimation favour put all other ancient councillors out of their accustomed favour that they were in before." In my inaugural lecture earlier this year, I talked about the importance of the close relationship between Wolsey and Henry, which begins at this time. There are only two people who we have records of that Henry VIII calls friend. Those two people are one, Anne Boleyn, and the other is Wolsey. There's no written record, at least, of him calling any other courtier or councillor a friend. And the reason I argued in that inaugural lecture was that Wolsey really took Henry seriously, as a young man wanting to do things, and not as a young man who had to be taught what to do and to be child-minded. Next thing, please. So he was very content to let Henry do all this kind of stuff and show off in front of his nobles and do all the things that he had to do, and he took over increasingly and directly the administration of the realm on Henry's behalf. And everybody else fell into line, because if he wanted to get, as in the nature of politics, if he wanted to get any policy passed or to Henry, you had to go through Wolsey. Ambassadors quickly recognised that too, and so he becomes the central focus of Wolsey's regime. And that's why he's sometimes referred to as Alter Rex. Next slide. Yes, so he begins to acquire this acquisition of titles and places. In February 1514, he became Bishop of Lincoln. In September the same year, he was made Archbishop of York on the death of Cardinal Bainbridge, who was Henry VIII's agent in Rome. And in September, he also, Pope Leo X, on Henry's direct request, and this is an important point to remember for what happens later, made him a cardinal. And in December the same year, Henry VIII appointed him Lord Chancellor of England. So it was an incredibly rapid rise between about 1509 and 1514. What you see here, if I get this right, you see the Cardinal's hat, which of course he has. You have his the Archiepiscopal crosses, which he also has. You have the blue heads of the leopards of the De la Pole family of Suffolk, which is where he came from. So he quartered their arms in his. You have, of course, the Tudor rose and two choughs or crows, which are part of the Westminster coat of arms, and we have them, I think, even in St Mary's coat of arms. And in the middle is a lion, which is often interpreted as a reference to Henry VIII, but it's not. It's a reference to Leo X. Leo as in lion, the Pope who made him Cardinal, Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici. And there you have his Cardinal's hat and all the rest of it. They become subsequently the various forms of that coat of arms are present. There you also see a griffin which is holding the pillars, the silver pillars, which were also a symbol of his authority and power, the cross keys of the papacy, and so on and so forth. Next one. Most usually seen these days in the arms of Christchurch, Oxford, which was his foundation as Cardinal College. Wolsey, by the time he reached this early summit of his career, was also a de facto husband and father, something of an exception to English bishops, who are generally renowned for their piety and chastity, even among European bishops. You know. He was the father of one Thomas Winter, born in 1510 to his mistress, or we might say de facto wife, Mistress Lark. He was educated for a time in Paris, travelled in Italy, but never really made the best of the talent that he might have had. He was given several benefices in East Anglia under his father's auspices, and was made Archdeacon of Suffolk at the age of 16, and a few years later held the same office in Norfolk. He ended his public career and recorded a place in history under the protection of Thomas Cromwell. Wolsey also had a daughter who was born in 1511. She became a nun in a West Country convent. And again, we only know about her through her coming to the attention of Thomas Cromwell in the mid-1530s, when she was about 25. And it's thought that he also may have had another son called Thomas Minton, who was educated at Winchester College. Again, Thomas Cromwell supported his career, and he went on to Oxford and subsequent travels in France before becoming a canon of Salisbury Cathedral, at which place he too fades from the record. So it's an interesting aspect of Wolsey that he has all the time his public career that he's continuing with Henry. He has a private life, he has children, and he has people for whom he's responsible. Next, please. Just another version of the arms of Wolsey from Hampton Court Palace. At about the time he became Cardinal, he also adopted the motto, which you see at the bottom. It's an engraving of what you can see today at Hampton Court in Clock Court, beneath the clock. And the motto is Dominus mihi adiutor, or the Lord is my guide. He adopted that from that period. This is also 1516, 1517 is also the time that he buys the manor of Hampton Court and begins to build on it. I've lost track of the slides now. Okay. That's the next one. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, there we go. I just want to say a little bit, but not too much, about Wolsey's legal and administrative record, because he has these two aspects to his work for Henry. He's the Lord Chancellor, and so he's responsible for the legal system, for the registration of parliamentary acts, and for all those kinds of things. And this is a scene of Henry VIII opening Parliament in the early part of his reign, and I'm sure you can identify Wolsey there under his cardinal's hat, with his archbishopric mitre next to Bishop Fox, and Warham of Canterbury, whose arms you can see there, next to Henry, and he's opening Parliament. So he made a great deal of the fact that he was the Lord Chancellor. He used to work very hard. Most weekdays he was found in Westminster Hall, supervising the entire legal administration, hearing cases in the Court of Chancery, which had been set up a while before. He was a very active Chancellor, and he emphasised law enforcement and the impartial administration of justice to high and low alike. and it's too much to go into now, but the Court of Chancery was a civil jurisdiction, and instead of hearing cases according to the very high-bound rules of common law, the forms of action which were used at common law, you could actually present your case in Chancery just on the facts, and it would be decided on the basis of what they called equity, out of which comes the equity division in the modern court. And it made it a very popular court to plead in, because you could get around all the sort of machinations of the lawyers and just get your case settled on the facts. So, not surprisingly, lots of people wanted to apply to it. That was great for Wolsey because it increased his business, it increased his sense that he was carrying out the King's justice, which he was charged with doing, and that's what he always said he was doing. But, of course, popularity meant that it was very quickly overburdened with cases, and became the original efficiency of the court was undermined by the popularity which he created in it. Next one. The next, and there's a sort of image of Wolsey from the 19th century. This is actually in the House of Lords, I think, one of the series of paintings that were done in the mid-20th century to commemorate great figures of the House of Lords and Commons. In addition to which, he also presided over the Royal Council when it sat as the Supreme Court. So the Royal Council has both a kind of political role to advise the King, but it's also the final Supreme Court for matters that arise from more junior jurisdictions. And Wolsey again makes that very popular. The one thing you have to do to get your case into the Royal the Royal Council, known as Star Chamber because of the decoration of the seal in the room in which it met, is to be able to show that there's been some breach of the public peace, or the King's peace. So if you're clever, you can arrange to have, you've got a civil case with somebody else, and if you're very clever, you can get one of your mates or their mates to come around and break a few windows, and therefore cause a breach of the King's peace, and therefore get your case heard by the Royal Council, and skirt around the complex jurisdictions that you'd otherwise have to go through. And Wolsey kind of encourages that. He says that he's in charge of delivering, as I said, the King's justice, the King's peace. But once again, as with Chancery, so with Star Chamber, he overwhelms his own courts with work, which means that he's tied down all the time at Westminster, which is important politically, because the King is not. The King is around in the countryside, he is travelling around, and the people who are with him are some of the Royal Council, the so-called council attendant, but the rest of them are with Wolsey, and he's trying to make all these noblemen, as you can imagine how excited they are to sit there 6 days a week, hearing these cases. So Wolsey is trying to run the country economically, run the country legally, and also trying to keep control of things politically with a fast-moving young monarch. So it's not an easy job. I'll pass over various other things that he did, but the kinds of legislation that he introduced, the kinds of legal reforms that he brought about, really did alienate the people who were most likely to do him damage, that is, the nobility and the land-owning gentry. One of the things which he was really against was enclosures, that is, the practice of enclosing public land in order to raise wool. Sir Thomas More made the famous joke about in England, in other parts of Europe, men ate sheep, but in England, the sheep ate men. And that's what it was referring to, the fact that people were being deprived of common land on which they could graze one or two head of cattle by landowners raising sheep, because the wool prices were great and they could sell them into Europe, and that's how you made your money. And Wolsey is dead against that. But standing up to that, trying to find out the extent of that problem, alienates, of course, the people who he most needs to depend upon, namely the nobility and the high gentry. So that's, if we can go on, that's Wolsey processing to Westminster, and it shows him there with his pillars and his axes and his crosses and all the rest of it. He was very pretentious. He was very conscious of trying to show his power at all times, both as the Cardinal and also as the Lord Chancellor. He always maintained that was because he was carrying out the King's instructions, and it was really royal power that he was reinforcing, but other people saw it rather differently. and was a source of criticism. The important thing about Wolsey and the church, which is the next sort of thing that we come on to, as well as being the head of the judiciary, he's also been appointed in 1518, not only a cardinal, which had happened in 1514, he was then made a cardinal legate, and that's incredibly important, a legate a latere. That is to say, he is appointed as the Pope's personal representative in England, a plenipotentiary. It's to do with foreign policy and his attempt to organise an international peace treaty between all the European states in that year. But it was very unusual to appoint a native of the country to which you were going to send this person as a cardinal legate. It would be the equivalent, for example, of appointing as the British ambassador to Washington an American citizen who'd never been to Britain and who was at the same time the American Secretary of State. It's an extraordinary situation which the papacy has, where they appoint as their representative in England someone who's never been to Rome, who doesn't know how Rome functions, but who is and at the same time is effectively the leading counsellor in England. There are all kinds of reasons why that happens, but it becomes the key to Wolsey's sense of himself for the next 10 to 15 years. That he has, next slide please, he has the power over the church. He outranks people like his predecessors, Cardinal Beaufort and Cardinal Morton. He outranks the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he virtually runs the church from his own office. So he's extraordinary. So he's running the legal system from Westminster, and he's running the entire church as well, the entire structure of the church. The monasteries, the cathedrals, everything to do with the church is also being run by Wolsey as the Pope's personal representative in England. Again, I could give you chapter and verse for hours on end about what he does in terms of trying to reform the monasteries. The first person to dissolve monasteries was not Thomas Cromwell. Where do you think Thomas Cromwell learnt how to dissolve monasteries? He did so in service to Cardinal Wolsey, because Wolsey wanted to close down small, largely defunct religious houses, buy up their lands, sell them, in order to promote education and the new learning in places like the college which he founds at IPSWICH and also, of course, at Cardinal College, Oxford. So that's where Cromwell learnt how to do the monasteries, which is why he was so great in the 1530s when Henry wanted somebody to do the monasteries over. Cromwell had been trained, in a sense, by Wolsey on what to do. And he knew where the bodies and all the money was. Next slide, I think. And again, that's Cardinal Morton, who was predecessor, worked with Henry VII very closely in very similar ways to Wolsey and Henry. Basically, what's happening is that Henry and Wolsey are together getting control not only of the state and the politics of the church, to the point that I would argue Henry VIII has a de facto supreme headship over the church in the 1520s through Wolsey. What he takes later is, in a sense, already what he's been given by Wolsey as the legate, because everything that Wolsey does in trying to reform the church in England is focused on tying the king to the church to the king, rather than, as the papacy thinks, which Wolsey keeps busily telling him he's trying to do, tying it to the papacy. So he makes as Morton had done before under Henry VII, he's trying to pull the English church and make it become an accountable national church. And this is long before, the fall and the break from Rome. Next slide. That's a letter. I don't think I've got time to read it all through, but that's a letter in which which Henry writes to Wolsey, in which he basically tells him that whatever he wants to do in various matters which Wolsey has asked advice upon, he's perfectly content. You do whatever you want. I leave it in your hands. Just get on with it. And I use it in teaching as an example of the close relationship between Henry and Wolsey, and the complete trust which Wolsey has for Henry and Henry for Wolsey, right up until the late 1520s. I'll see if this works, but I will just pass over the foreign policy stuff because it could take us all night to sort of get there. The Field of Cloth of Gold, treaties which tie Henry into alliances in Europe, Wolsey's whole project in foreign policy can be summed up relatively quickly. That is to keep Henry at the forefront of European affairs, either by war, in which he tries to find finances for him and provide his armies for him, but when that's not possible, which is most of the time, through advantageous peace treaties, such as the one in 1518, which leads to the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, and various other treaties that follow. So Wolsey is, not only is he running, as I've said, the state, the legal system, the church, he's also running the foreign policy of Henry's state, and going overseas from time to France to negotiate treaties. I mean, he's the one person I want to meet, you know. If I ever get to heaven, I will say, can I meet Cardinal Wolsey? Presumably he's there. And sort of say, how did you do it? You know, when did you have time to have a cup of tea? Because you're just so busy the whole time. It's this extraordinary figure. What I want to do is just touch briefly then on Wolsey and his educational patronage and his architectural patronage. Next one. And again. This is his most famous, I suppose, educational institution is, of course, Cardinal College at Oxford, which is now Christchurch, and you see a plan of what it looked like in Wolsey's time. It was designed to be a centre for new learning, for updating theology, for bringing theology together with the humanities, the Studia Humanitatis, which was the fashionable curriculum in Europe in the 16th century. So that boys who went to that college would have a good mixture, Wolsey hoped, of traditional Orthodox theology, so that they would be equipped to defend orthodoxy in the kingdom, but also be exposed to ideas of Latin and Greek scholarship and the ideas of the more philosophical ideas, so that they would be more well-rounded. And if you read the statutes of Christchurch as it became known, that's what it was all about. But it is still on a bombastic scale. I mean, it is it's still the biggest college in Oxford, and it's not the most attractive by any means. It was meant to be, for those of you who know Tom Quad at Christchurch, it was meant to be all cloistered and everything, but it was never done. It was just on such a huge scale that it could never be completed. By the time Wolsey fell from power, it was still, as it were, half built. He was lucky in a way that Henry took it over and eventually became Christchurch. But it tells you a lot about the man's outlook on life, that while he's doing all these other things, he's also arranging the funding and the development of this educational institution. Next, there it is again, the modern look of it, and again. That would be the, I don't particularly like this sculpture, but it's in Ipswich, it was put up a few years ago. That's probably how Wolsey wanted people to see him. Not as the great cardinal, but as the teacher. You see him sitting there, as it were, preaching and teaching, as if he were an Oxford dog, you know, discoursing with people about things. And I remember talking in my inaugural about the pussycat that is next to him in that sculpture. So that's probably a sense of what Wolsey saw himself as an educational patron. That's his first residence in London, Bridewell, which we could pass over. And York Place was where his headquarters was in London. It's now roughly where the Ministry of Defence building is, which is why I show you there. But that's where his London residence was as Archbishop of York. And that's from there he commuted the short distance to Westminster Hall each morning to do his work in Chancery and Star Chamber. And again. And that's the cellar, which was originally Wolsey's wine cellar, which is now about 5 floors below the Ministry of Defence, and you can occasionally get in to see it, and it's not very far from the banqueting house built by Inigo Jones. And again, yes, that's just a nice image of the two of them together at the high point, because we now sort of begin to come to the fall. Next one. Hampton Court, of course, is the local manifestation of Cardinal Wolsey in this part of London. And as I said, it's extended and built on in the 1520s by him as an entertainment palace for foreign ambassadors, for courtiers, and to show his style as a cardinal, as an international figure. Not just an English politician, but this was his way of showing the rest of the world that as a cardinal, he ranked with his fellow cardinals in Europe. And again. Just a few close-ups of Hampton Court. I'm sure everybody knows it. And again. Just the terracotta roundels which he patronised. And again, that's the one I showed you earlier, which is that's the actual terracotta roundel made by the Italian designer Giovanni da Maiano. He's a great patron of Italian architects and designers in what he was doing. Again, that's him apparently handing over Hampton Court to Henry in about 1527. There's no actual evidence that he did formally hand the palace over to Henry. He always called it the King's Palace of Hampton Court, always regarded it as the King's as well as his own. But it became part of the story of his fall that he tried to buy Henry's favour by giving it to him. And again. I won't say much about this. This is the Manor of the Moor in Hertfordshire, which was at least as big, they think, looking at time team programmes, etc. from a few years ago, at least as big as Hampton Court. And he used that again as an entertainment and hunting palace for entertaining the king and other people. So I'm now going to ask Mark to go through quite a few of them. These are the angels from Wolsey's tomb. These have only recently been recovered. In the last 10 years or so, they've been identified. He had this huge design being made by an Italian architect called Benedetto da Rovezzano of his tomb, which had a huge sarcophagus into which he was going to be laying. They had these four angels with candlesticks which were going to be set around. It eventually ended up, Wolsey, when he fell, he didn't get that of course, Henry took all the materials of the tomb over in order to build a tomb for himself, which was neither built anywhere either. The sarcophagus ended up in Windsor from where it was taken, and it's now in the crypt in St Paul's Cathedral in London, and in there is not Wolsey, not Henry VIII, but the victor of Trafalgar, Lord Nelson, is actually ended up in Wolsey's tomb in St Paul's. Next one. That was the sort of design of what the tomb would have looked like. And it's thought that Henry VIII's tomb, had it been completed, would have looked something like that. And these same Italian designers were working on Wolsey's tomb as Henry's. Next one. Oh dear, yes. I know I'm pressing against time now, but essentially, of course, Wolsey fell from power in 1529 because he couldn't bring about the divorce or the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in favour of Anne Boleyn. Wolsey was imaginative, he was enthusiastic, he was energetic, but he was also very conventional. Although as Cardinal Legate, he had considerable powers to release people from vows, all that kind of stuff, he knew himself that this was something which was beyond even his own power as legate to do anything about. This was a papal decision, that no cardinal legate had ever, at a local level, granted a king an annulment of a marriage which the rest of the church regarded as perfectly valid, which was the case with Henry and Catherine of Aragon. He could have done it in early 1527, the first time that Henry asked him to do so, but he drew back and instead got Henry involved in a very, very long and involved and complex process, which eventually ended up with the legatine trial, the legatine trial against Catherine in 1529, from which he appealed to Rome, and the whole wearisome business that went on, and the next one, the whole wearisome business which everybody in the rest of Europe objected to. Wolsey was not helped by the fact that just as the case got underway, for reasons which needn't detain us, Rome was sacked by the Emperor Charles V's troops and virtually made the Pope the prisoner of the Emperor. The Emperor was, of course, Catherine of Aragon's nephew and was not going to let anything happen that would disgrace his family. And that is about it, really. He was also the only person that could have helped the Pope's family, the Medici, to get back in power in Florence, out of which they'd been chucked. So Clement VII was not really going to do anything against Charles V's wishes. Next one. And so that is really where it was stymied. And by October 1529, after the failure of that court trial, Wolsey really was left with nowhere else to go. He was deprived of the chancellorship in October 1529. Next slide. He was deprived of the chancellorship in October 1529. Which was a terrible moment for him, because that had been his great sort of symbol of connection with Henry VIII. He was ordered in November, about this time of the year, to remove from York Place to Esher, and then finally to go up to York, to his archbishopric. They brought a charge of what's called praemunire against him, which is the charge that you have acknowledged an exterior authority to be greater than the king, which of course Wolsey had done, in a sense, because he was Cardinal of the papacy, at Henry VIII's insistence. But in 29, this suddenly became a crime which he committed. He lost all his possessions. He was forced to beg for forgiveness from the king. The king did eventually pardon him, but said that he should go up to York. And he went up there in the early spring of 1530. And then the most mysterious part of the whole thing is he seems to have got himself in, it's alleged that he got himself involved in negotiations to try to get himself restored to power, that he was writing to Charles V and also to Francis I, the King of France, to try to persuade Henry to bring him back to power. His opponents, probably Anne Boleyn and her entourage, would have none of that. And so, for reasons which we haven't got time to go into, which is very complex, which I'm trying to sort out in the book, essentially, charges of treason were planted on him, and he was being brought back down to London to face trial for treason. Next slide, please. To face trial for treason in October 1530. Took a long time to get him back down to London, in the course of which he developed. He'd always been subject to illnesses, particularly gastrointestinal problems, dysentery and things like that. One of the reasons he got Hampton Court was that the water and the climate were better there than in London. And it seems that he contracted some form of dysentery in the November of 1530 as he was being brought back down to London to face trial. The idea that he would necessarily have been executed or even convicted of treason, it's an assumption that everybody makes. I'm not sure. I think there are grounds for saying that Henry was really trying to use the arrest of Wolsey as a way of putting pressure on the papacy again about the divorce issue. It wasn't that he hated Wolsey, that he wanted him dead or anything like that now, but it was very useful to have the head of the church. Remember, I was saying that Wolsey had become effectively the head of the church in England under Henry. To have the head of the church arrested for treason, for not obeying the king, sent a very powerful message to the papacy about what, and to the English church, about what Henry wanted, which was an annulment of his marriage. He died at about 8 p.m. on the night of the 29th of November 1530, and he was interred at Leicester Abbey, which is not very far from where they found a certain king a few years ago, namely Richard III. I don't want him to go looking for Wolsey. He must be there somewhere, fairly close under the car park or somewhere, but I don't want him to go and find him. So in the end, having pulled all that aspects of state together for Henry, you could almost say that he was the inverse of Sir Thomas More, who, of course, at his execution said that, I die the king's good servant, but God's first. You could almost say of Wolsey that he died, in the end, God's good servant, but always the king's first. So thank you.
Okay, so we have a bit of time for questions before we have a few refreshments just through the room. So I'll open it up to the floor, and I shall hand over a mic so people can hear you. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Start over there.
Thank you very much for that most interesting talk. I was surprised to hear that he had 3 illegitimate children. Of course, he was an ordained priest, I presume.
He was.
Otherwise, he couldn't have become Cardinal.
Yes, minor orders, but yes, ordained.
Yes. I was just wondering how he could not come into scandal as a result of having 3 illegitimate children and a mistress, and how would that not disturb his career?
Because although it was relatively unusual in an English context, it was not at all unusual in the wider context of the church. There were quite a lot of married priests in the late 15th, early 16th century church in England and certainly elsewhere. He was always very careful. He never paraded his family. Of course, it was all done in secret. Thomas Winter he acknowledged as his son. The daughter, again, as General McCulloch in his recent biography of Cromwell points out, is only known about because Cromwell seems to have identified her as Wolsey's child, and also this other Thomas Minton in a similar fashion. So the only one that Wolsey sort of acknowledged was Thomas Winter, who was the eldest of them. It's a kind of case of keeping things on the quiet, as long as it's you don't ask, don't tell, don't make an issue of it, and you're all right. And besides which, he was just too important, too significant for the king, for him to suffer particularly by that. It's very unclear how many people knew about anybody other than Thomas Winter. And of course, if it was just one, well, you know, one mistake, never mind. We don't have any different proof that the other 2 were his, but it seems likely.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions?
Did Wolsey die a rich man?
No, he didn't. He was indeed very wealthy as Archbishop and as Cardinal, but all his wealth came from the king. And because he was convicted of praemunire, this effectively recognising a higher authority than the king, he had to confess to it in order to save his life, effectively, because it was almost equivalent to treason in itself. And all his property was thereby forfeited to the crown, so he lost everything. What he couldn't, of course, be taken away from him was the bishoprics, because they were, as it were, from the papacy and the church rather than from the crown. So he lost his palaces, he lost his possessions. But he was given a pension of £4,000 a year by Henry in late 1529, which is the equivalent of a duke's income. So although he was sent north and he kept complaining about money, and maybe that was one of the reasons why people got annoyed with him, he kept moaning about what was going to happen to his colleges at Ipswich and also at Cardinal College, Oxford. But he was actually looked after by Henry, and by the time Henry gives that money to him, the idea that he's already conspiring outside the realm is in currency. So my idea, my thought is, if Henry really does believe that Wolsey is actually conspiring against him, why does he provide him with this income and send him tokens of friendship and all the rest of it? Maybe he was just trying to lure him into doing even more stupid things, but probably not. So yeah, he dies impoverished compared to what he had been, but as he was the first to acknowledge, everything he had came from the king, and that's the key to understanding Wolsey from first to last.
Thank you. I have a question about the first biography that you mentioned, I think by Cavendish.
Yes.
Really a kind of historiographical question. What are the precedents to that text? Does it gesture towards saints' lives at all? What were Cavendish's motivations for writing?
Good question. I think, as I said, it was written during the reign of Mary, and I think Cavendish was always very loyal to Wolsey, and he and people knew about Wolsey. He was, of course, up until Cardinal Pole, of course, who's Mary's Archbishop of Canterbury, the last Cardinal of England. And I think he probably sensed that the time was right it was okay to write about the late Cardinal, because you couldn't, in the reign of Henry VIII and, of course, of Edward, his son, because Wolsey was persona non grata. So it's an effort to sort of get people to reflect on, remember who this cardinal was and how important he had been in Henry's reign. But with you mentioned saints' lives, it is a bit like that. The sense of this hagiography of him. He's trying to excuse why Wolsey becomes so pretentious and so ostentatious. And he tries to put it on the basis of fortune, that this humble man was raised because of all his talents to this great height, but in the end it all became too much for him, and he crashed to the earth, and beware, that you follow that course. But in doing so, he tells you a whole lot about Wolsey and how marvellous it was to be in his service and how fantastic it was to be with. So he's still the principal source for any kind of personal information that we have, which is virtually nothing about Wolsey, his illnesses and things, because he was in close service to him. So a kind of secular sainthood almost. Sure.
I'm just wondering about, obviously, so all super interesting. I'm just wondering about Henry. Did he have any regrets after Wolsey's demise? Did he look, I mean, lots of things happened to Henry. Did he look back and think, we never had it so good at some point?
Yes, well, he does regret the loss of Wolsey several times. He says, we're all a bunch of incompetents, etc., and that's why I think by early 1530 there's, if you believe the conspiracy theory that charges are being trumped up against Wolsey precisely in order to stop him ever having the possibility of getting back in Henry's favour, because the Conservatives, the Howard family, the Boleyns, all that group, that for whom the marriage to Henry depends upon everything, they're desperate to make sure that he never gets the opportunity, because they know if Wolsey gets back to Henry, there's every chance that he's going to get back into favour, because that silver, that golden tongue that he had, that capacity to just please Henry and give him what he wanted, would have revived. And so Starkey and others say that that's why they planted charges of treason on him, to make sure that he would be got rid of for just that reason. Yes, Henry does regret him. And as I said at the start, he's the only person apart from Anne Boleyn who we have any record of as Henry calling a friend. And he was, for 20 years, the person upon whom the king most closely depended.
If Wolsey had the opportunity to annul the marriage between Henry and Catherine, why didn't he take it?
Because he was not sure that he did. He had, as I said, very extensive what they called relaxing powers, or dispensing powers, even touching marriage. But the very particular case of the conflict between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which was about the brother's widow and all the rest of it, he felt himself that it was beyond the scope of his powers. And he probably was able to explain to Henry that he couldn't do it. That his legatine authority, extensive though it was, and by that time he'd been made legate for life, which is virtually unheard of, yet for the very particular case involving a royal marriage, he felt he couldn't do it, that it had to be done by the Pope. Because all the other royal marriages that had been annulled in the previous 15 years, like that of, for example, Louis XII of France, Charles VIII, they had been done by the Pope at the time and nobody else. And I think he balked at, because I said he was imaginative but also conventional. And I think there was also the thinking that if I do this, and the people, this is a very strong Catholic church at this period. I mean, England is a very, very strongly Catholic country. If I do this and the people don't buy it, what happens? It's going to look really messy. I must have absolute authority. It was this characteristic of working with Henry, that letter which I showed you. Henry would have said you can do whatever you want, but Wolsey always came back and checked. Are you sure this is what you want? Can I do this? And only then would he proceed. And I think that mentality also extended towards the papacy, that he said, if I do this, I've got to make sure it sticks. I can't have mess, like Brexit. Therefore, it's for the Pope. And I think Henry probably recognised that. What Henry thought at the time was, well, that's right, we'll just sort it out then. That's fine, just sort it out. Which, of course, Wolsey would have said, sure, no worries, boss, I'll do that. Except that he couldn't. So there we go. It was just too complicated. A bit like Brexit. Right, let's stop saying that.
Yeah, I
Must
think we have
remain.
time.
So,
Go on. I was just going to say, I think we have time for one or two last questions.
or just a drink, maybe.
Grill Glenn.
Go on.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you for that. I first met Wolsey through Shakespeare,
Oh, yeah.
and through, well, partly through Shakespeare,
Yes.
through the shared play Henry VIII.
Yes.
And it was really following up from the previous question about the rehabilitation of Wolsey and whether Shakespeare had a role to play in that, and I suppose just a comment around the politics of that play when it was written and what it meant, particularly because Elizabeth appears right at the end of it, I suppose.
Yes, and the fact that during a performance of it, the Globe Theatre burns down.
Yeah, I don't mention it. As a theatre historian, I don't mention it.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. That by the time, and of course, Shakespeare uses Cavendish, and some of the episodes which Cavendish records in his biography then appear in the play, like when Henry comes disguised to Hampton Court and Wolsey pretends to not know, oh, who is this strange man? And then is revealed as the king, that kind of play acting which they got into. I'm not sure I know enough about the particular circumstances of the publication of the play itself, but certainly by that time, Wolsey is sufficiently far back in history to be a foil for anything that Shakespeare wants to make Henry VIII to be. So he's kind of safe enough by then to come out and be this grand cardinal and you know, show, because I think the burden of the play is that Henry's is right to be heading in the direction that he is, of course, because you know the Supreme Governor is around watching what her father had been doing. So he's not a dangerous character, not a threatening character by the time that Shakespeare's writing about him. So he can be brought out partly for comic and partly for sort of grandiose, you know, stage effects for that play. And of course, acknowledging that there was a close relationship between the king and the god.